You've learned in our writing process discussions that peer review and constructive feedback are integral to students' engagement in a genuine writing process. You've also learned that teachers should also perceive themselves as writers and engage in the writing processes the same way students do. You've learned from Tracy Gardner's research that when we teachers create writing assignments or other instructional documents, we can strengthen those documents by sending them through a careful peer review process. And finally, we learned from Christenberry and Lindblom some helpful ways to guide students through a positive, productive peer review process. Along those lines, I have found it helpful to discuss with students the importance of recognizing strengths and opportunities during the peer review process. Christenberry and Lindblom, as well as other writing process scholars, assert that a peer review process is most productive when it focuses on the positive. There is always something in a draft that works well. Sometimes we have to look carefully for that something, but it's there. We teachers must not only tell students what's working well, but also show them how to recognize strengths in a peer's draft. Recognizing those strengths is one way that we focus on facilitative commentary as opposed to directive commentary. Numerous times during peer review sessions, I've heard people, both students and teachers alike, begin with the phrase, "This is good, but..." The phrase "this is good" in and of itself is not specific. It's not facilitative, and left on its own, it's not helpful. In fact, it's just a gateway toward telling writers what's not good in the draft. We should delay, or even better, omit the word "but" and wax more specifically on what is good in the draft. Christenberry and Lindblom offer the suggestions, "I like the way you," or "I like the way your draft does one thing or another." Other ways to recognize strengths are these examples. "These passages made me smile." "These passages really resonated with me or made me think." "The strongest points you made in your piece were these." Another helpful way to find strengths is to use the assignment guidelines as a guide. Does the assignment say an essay needs a clear thesis? If so, and if the draft does have a clear thesis, say so. Or find other ways the assignment is directly meeting the criteria, as with these examples. This narrative has a catchy hook in its introduction. Your personal experience example in paragraph 2 really shows me what you mean. You have found a valid, reliable source to support your claim in the 4th paragraph. This is an excellent way to end your piece with a nice sense of closure. I encourage you to use these strategies when finding strengths in your peers' work as well as your students' work. And keep in mind that these kinds of positive observations can work when giving other kinds of feedback too, so you can try them when you're observing someone else teaching, when you're evaluating someone's presentation, or when you're listening to someone's speech. And now for the opportunities. In the typical peer review process, these details would be the ones that follow that word "but." By thinking of these observations as opportunities, we help ourselves avoid directive feedback. Too often, writers tell each other, "You need to do this," or "You should do that." Those directive remarks give the impression that the decision to make changes is the reviewer's and not the writer's. Those kinds of directive remarks could also put the writer on the defensive, which might discourage the writer instead of encouraging them to follow through with the feedback. Instead of relying on those directive remarks, we can offer the same observations with encouragement, while also acknowledging that the writer is in the driver's seat, not the reviewer. Try using more "tell me more" feedback. That will enable you to anchor onto what's going well and encourage the writer to include more of those strong strategies. So in this table, I provided some examples of how directive feedback could be converted to facilitative feedback. For instance, instead of saying, "You need a good example in this paragraph," you could say, "You had such a nice personal experience example in paragraph 2. Could you include a similar example in paragraphs 3 and 4? Instead of just commanding the writer to put more examples in your second and third paragraphs, you could say, the personal anecdote in paragraph 4 really grabs my attention. I had hoped to read the outcome of that event. Could you tell me more about that? Notice how the directive feedback in this table is expressed in terms of commands, not even requests, but commands, whereas the facilitative feedback is expressed in terms of questions. You might even use the word opportunities when you notice opportunities in a writer's draft. Here are some examples. I noticed that you wrote about your mother's experience in this passage. I see an opportunity to quote her there, a chance to allow your readers to hear her own words. Here's another. You are especially skilled at using figures of speech. I see some opportunities to include more engaging metaphors in your story. Notice how in both of those examples, the suggestion is springboarded from an observation of something strong in the draft. So let those strengths be the springboard toward the observation of opportunities. Recognizing opportunities can be especially helpful to the reviewer and to the writer when the reviewer sees something that definitely needs to be fixed. Here are some examples. As I read, I sailed through the pages, but then stopped at the top of page 3. I had to read that sentence 2 or 3 times to grasp what you were trying to explain. Here's an opportunity to break this long sentence into 2 or 3 sentences. Have you given that some thought? In paragraph 4, I see an opportunity to read your sentences aloud, either to yourself or to someone else. I think if you do that, you'll hear where the phrases are a little tangled, and the sound of your reading will help you figure out what might be added, deleted, or moved around. Those 2 examples point out some language problems or some confusing sentences, but they do so in such a way that they encourage the writer to take a more careful look at the sentences. Instead of commanding that something be fixed, they point out opportunities to give those passages a second and maybe a third look. Pointing out strengths and opportunities enables teachers to evaluate and encourage simultaneously. As with any teaching practice, we need to get into the habit of responding to students in positive ways. So when you evaluate student writing, either drafts or turned-in versions, you have an opportunity to look for strengths and opportunities and emphasize them in your students' work. In the coming weeks, you'll have the opportunity to give such feedback a try.